been working out well.
Yeah, so I tried to use something better, but I couldn't make it work, so I'm just going to record using OBS and then take it through Audacity and upload it to YouTube as a sound.
Okay.
So, my class, do you want to give a preamble first, Daniel?
Yeah, sure. I mean, welcome to Guy. This is going to be a really interesting event that we have here today, taking the place of our normal class. We're basically going to hear from him on how to critique. Well, we're going to hear critiques of some poetry, but also maybe we'll be able to glean how to get better ourselves at critiquing pieces. And I don't know all the facets that he wants to address. It would be nice to hear if he had an opinion on how to take critiques better too, because some people are actually, get really defensive, or they don't know how to take a critique. So hopefully we can address a lot of those different aspects and kind of lead the community that we have, at least, towards a place where this is seen as something normal and this is seen as something very valuable. And we're planning on doing this more frequently and going over some people's pieces that are somewhat short. I think he said less than 250 words to make it more manageable.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's going to be the class for today.
Okay, so I've prepared for myself a couple of notes. It's mostly like bullet points that I'm going to discuss. Hopefully it won't be more than like somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll actually dive into actual critique. So let's start with the most important point. Critique is born out of empathy. And when I say empathy, I don't mean you have to be nice and cuddly and such. Empathy in its actual baser sense, which means you have to be able to see what the other person is trying to go for. When I give you critique on your piece, the most important question is, what are you trying to do? Because if your piece is beautiful, but it's not what you were trying to do with it, then in some sense you failed, and vice versa. Even if you are trying to do something that I personally disagree with, then it's fine, because you succeeded in what you set out to do. And it's actually important because too many people in today's world think that if you call yourself a critic, it means you are negative. That's not true. To be a critic means to be able to pay close attention to things, to be able to unpack them. It is often harder to be a positive critic, like at least for me, because I always see all the negative aspects of things. So be advised, like if you call yourself a critic, it is the opposite of giving yourself permission to be mean to people and to tear them down, because criticism is a gift, and if people don't appreciate your gift, then as a gift giver, you've probably failed. Okay, so now that we know what is the baseline of critique, it's important to critique is an art. Like, you know the saying, those who can't do critique, that's critique on the art of critique. But it's not something that simple. It's not something you just do. It's something, but just like all writing, everyone can do critique, everyone can write, you can get better at it, but some people are better than others at others than it. But you can learn it, you can get better, and just like today's lesson, just like the challenge Daniel is running, you get better by doing. And you do have the option of training yourself to do critique all the time. You don't necessarily have to share it. So, how does one get better at critiquing poetry or at writing poetry? I touched this topic a few days ago and many times in the past, and Hazem actually mentioned my advice to him earlier this week about what do you do when you feel you are stuck? Where do you go for inspiration? Poetry is writing. If you want to get inspiration for writing or to get better at writing anything, then you consume anything, especially any piece of art. It doesn't matter if you go to television or if you read poetry or even cartoons. Same with critique. If someone tells you that they don't know how to critique poetry or they don't know how to critique anime, which is something I've done a lot of in the past, then you tell them, have you watched movies before? Have you read books before? If so, then do you know how to critique those? And if they tell you they do, then by and large it is the exact same skill set. There are a few minor details that differ, but there is no real difference between critiquing poetry and critiquing books. So if you want to get better at critique, then just critique whatever you come across. Okay, now we are going to get to the nitty-gritty. There are I think there are by and large, two different forms of critique. The first is editing critique. I am now going to link you. I've just linked a poem by a friend of mine that I edited. Please open the link. Don't actually type anything there, but do open it. If you can see, this is what I call editing critique, where I go over the lines. I go over the poem, and every single thing that bugs me or that I think of, I comment on. If I'm actually going to go over the first stanza because this is an example, so we want to learn from it. The poem is titled Child's Play. The parched and thirsty ground drank greedily their sweat and blood. Beaten backward, the leftmost flank allowed the enemy, rank and rank, to pour around them like a flood. So you can see that even like in the second word, I ask him why he's going for both parched and thirsty. That this is like an editing thing. Why do you need both? Later I question the sound of greedily because a poem has flow, and I thought this word both broke the flow because I find that G.
Hello everyone, how are you guys doing today?
Yes, we are actually in the middle of explaining critique. So open the link in the text channel and listen, Steve. So both I thought that the G and D sound broke the flow, and I thought it was superfluous because the fact that the earth is parched and thirsty, we can assume it will drink greedily. And then I go for blood. I didn't realize that he's going for rhyming at this point, which is why in general you should do what I say, not what I do, which is you should go over an entire poem before critiquing it. But here, like the word blood, I found the word blood causes a whiplash with the expectations he set from the title. The title is part of the poem. So it's important to realize that when you critique, the reason critique actually helps you be a better author is because when you look at someone else's poem, it teaches you to look at every word you choose. You look at every instant of punctuation. You look at if the word sounds right in terms of tone, if it sounds right in terms of sound, if it is actually needed. From a second stanza, I'm going to read it now.
Dang, we have a lot of people in here today. Can anyone hear me? I'm trying to figure out if I'm...
Sweetie, they are, but actually Guy is holding a class, and I don't think you can hear him.
Yeah, I don't think he can hear anyone because he has... Yeah.
Yeah, there's a weird thing that happens where you can't hear anyone.
Yeah, no, he has the icon. Yeah. Okay, so...
Hello everyone, can you guys hear me?
I think we need to tag him. This is what happens when there are too many channels in a server. Okay, so I'm going to read the second stanza. Crackling in their midst with a thud, Wormage Alexos stabbed and slashed, wading through the hellish mud, he made the enemy turn and scud, his seeing blade through them smashed. So my commentary here is, the first one was crackling and thud are very different sounds. Like you have to, like here you can see some of the stuff Daniel ran classes on before regarding like images, because there is an image. Crackling, even though it's a sound, creates an image, and it's a very different image from the word thud. So here I complain that the two images clash. I comment to him that his seeing blade through them smashed, but a seeing blade, again, the smash is the wrong image. So I told him that he should switch the slashed and smashed. And scud, I told him, though the word is right, there is something that is called rhyme-led. It sounds like the focus is too much on the rhyme, which is a danger when you go, like when you go for rhymes, you try to make things flow better. But if the rhyme is stressed too much, then it actually distracts the reader. Like the rhyme becomes the focus rather than the image, but it is trying to convey. So this is an example for what I mean by editing critique. Editing critique, you usually don't get it after you publish a piece, because it's a bit hard to do this like in a comment section. This is why we tend to use in workshops Google Documents to run it. It's also a bit rude to question every word choice used by someone else, like after a poem. Like, did you really need to use thud here? And the thud and scud, I don't like it. That's a bit too much. Like, but most people don't actually like getting editing critique, but giving and receiving editing critique actually helps you improve the basic building blocks of your poetry. It makes you turn to look at every word, the image it creates, the sound it creates. To give editing critique, you should go over a poem in its entirety first. You should like look to see if you are using a certain meter, if you are going for a rhyme. You should try to find if images contradict one another. And it also helps you find out if there are things that repeat. Like if you scroll down some of my commentary, like I know Dallas, so I'm being a bit more blunt than you should be with strangers. Like I tell him you're mixing passive and active voices for the toys here. I'm giving him this doesn't rhyme. I try to give him suggestions of what to change. I tell him that a certain stanza doesn't flow, or that he's not ingrammatically correct in where he says the looming combat held him sway. Like I tell him that's not English. Like you shouldn't like phrase it like that. I only do it because I actually know Dallas quite well. But yeah, that's an example of a first type of critique, which you usually ask for and get before you publish a piece. And even though it's the sort most people want less to get, if I'm honest, it's the sort most people need more. This is the basic stuff, and no matter how good you are at poetry, you can always improve like a word choice or a grammar choice or something of the sort. Now we are going to use a poem of Elaine's for the second type of critique, which is what I call impression-based or impressionistic. I'm actually going to ask Elaine to read his poem. It's better than the alternative of me reading his poem for you. Elaine? please step forward and read your poem, which I linked in the channel.
Yeah, this is called The Uninhabitable, and read it. I gaze upon a lamp cast shadow and question, why do you stalk my steps, yet flee my approach? A response, rare, was offered in the wordless way shades do. A fleeting turn to stare at stars and dream of lightless space. Confused, I posed anew. Why do you brand me aegis, yet fear my embrace? Mute and expressionless, our gazes met. Then, to absence, parted way. What is this blank expanse? The path of the forlorn, of the formless lost, the forgetfulness of deep sleep, and a discarded lighter. What is this blank expanse to me? Penless pages and torn margins, coffee, left still sitting and lapped by candlelight, eyes waiting for my own to rest.
Okay, so if you scroll down, you will find my comment. It is quite long, quite long. I'm known as Geek Corner on Steemit, so you can find it. Even though on some level you can give editing feedback even without reading the poem in its entirety first, you should not do it at all, like no matter what, for impressionistic feedback, because impressionistic feedback is holistic, while editing feedback focuses on the word, on the sentence, on the stanza, or on a word in relation to the feel of the entire thing. Impressionistic feedback is more about, like, if you tell someone, this made me feel X, Y, Z, you are already giving them impressionistic feedback. And if, before I go to my example, it's also important to note that is there such a thing as wrong feedback? There is. Wrong feedback is feedback where you are trying to force the author or the piece to conform to what you want it to be rather than what they want it to be. But if you go about this made me feel X, Y, Z, then there is no wrong feedback. Like, if I combine it to look at both the impressionistic and editing feedback, you don't have to tell people, you don't have to give people suggestions. Like, if you tell them, this word doesn't work for me here, at the end of the day, it's their job to find out why and replacement. If I look at video games, for instance, one of the sayings that struck with me is, players can tell you what they don't find fun, but they can't tell you why it's not fun for them. Like, most people, when they tell you why something doesn't work, actually don't identify it correctly. That takes a lot more training to be able to pinpoint not just what doesn't work, but why, or why something that does work, which is actually harder than the reverse. But you should feel free to tell, I don't like this, or I like this. This is the first layer of impressionistic feedback, and you can't be wrong about that. Your experiences are your experiences. So after we've read Alain's poem, let's look at my comment. Like, first of all, I start with things that relate to Alain's larger corpus of work. I can do it because I've gone the extra step beyond just reading this poem and having read a lot of Alain's poetry. So I talked to him a bit, but I like to see him write more poetry of the light, because the topic of shadows and darkness is something that repeats in his works, and that's also like something you can tell someone as impressionistic feedback. So here I tell him, I look at the direct speech. Direct speech is, why do you stalk my steps yet flee my approach? In general, it is something that I personally find doesn't work very well in poetry. And here is another lesson on critique. You should be able to separate what you don't like with what is bad. If you're not sure, assume that if you don't like something, it is your taste, not an objective bad thing. So like sometimes I tell someone I don't like X, and sometimes I tell them X is not good. And because they know that I actually differentiate between the two, they know that there is a difference. So in general, I find direct speech in poetry to break the flow. So I identify it and tell Alain that I'm not sure whether he should cut it out in general pieces or keep working on trying to make it work. That's the first piece of impressionistic feedback I give him. And I tell him that even third body, I posed it anew, asking why it branded me ages, yet feared my embrace would work better. So here is me giving him some feedback, but the feedback is not truth. It's something for him to consider, because it's important to remember, like, if you give someone feedback, it is up to them whether to take it in or not. I will tell you that most feedback people give me, like, it's not that I ignore the feedback, but I consider it and then don't implement it. And it's fine. Like, I don't expect people to accept most of my critique, except as something to make them think of something, because my goal is to help them find what they want their piece to say, not for them to write my piece. And then I go, the second stanza has a good flow to it, the penultimate stanza not so much. Not that all stanzas and poems must flow, but the penultimate one just doesn't. Lighter sits there like a jagged piece of bone in the middle of my steak. Never understood those T-bone lovers. It's mostly the final line, but also slightly the deep sleep that fits the final line and the final words within, not as a line you must wake up after. Because if I read you that stanza again, what is this blank expanse, the path of a formless lost, the forgetfulness of deep sleep? Up to here, you can feel like the stanza carrying you along, but if you listen deep sleep, like your tongue goes down, you keep getting stuck on it on the end, so I expect it to end here, and the discarded lighter. Sort of feels like an appendix, so I give Alain that piece, and then I go as to the piece as a whole, which is what most people should focus on, like, to begin with. In editing, focus on the little, on the impressionistic, focus on the whole. As to the piece as a whole, it is an interesting one. It lacks that final punch of a clear-cut missive. It is more of a formless wonderment, an expressionist painting. I am not sure this is where you wish to leave it. So if you see, like here, someone is typing very loudly. That's the bar team. So if you look at it, like, here I'm trying to look at what he's trying to do with a piece, and I'm not sure I know, because I didn't write it, so I air a guess or two, and I tell him what if I think it works or not. And I tell him that if he wants, and here I give him a pointer, which means that some more hints need to be peppered within, and perhaps the last stanza ironed out, or perhaps even an additional one added, such as what the shade plans to do, or that is probably the single best thing left to the reader's imagination. And if you want to keep that more half-formed feel, then I think such questions as you ask might be too on the nose. Cut the last line in the penultimate stanza. Add more about the tiredness, of the unformed nature of it all. I feel that is where the poem is actually heading. There is strength in unanswered questions, but perhaps even more so when the questions are not asked aloud. So here I basically see two different directions I think Alain might be going, and I tell him that he's a bit too much in one direction and a bit not enough in the other direction, so I tell him that he should pick a direction and double down on it. It could be wrong, like I could be entirely mistaken, and this is why I present it as I think and my opinion in these areas, because it's not my poem, and it's always important to remember it. And that's the end of my first, like, I'm going to give you like a few words on how to take critique. I'll be honest, getting critique is hard. This is why in college they have all those workshops. The real reason for all those workshops, even more than training you to give critique and all the things that giving critique can teach you, I think, is that they prepare you to receive critique. Because I have friends that when I critiqued their pieces, they told me that they had to go and take a breather. Like, your pieces are never as bad as you fear they are, but they're also probably never as good as you hope they are. And good critique hurts, not because it is mean, but because if you create something that you care about and people tell you that it is not perfect, even if you expect it, it doesn't mean that it's easy. So I recommend people who receive critique to read it and then pause and not reply. Don't edit based off of it, because whether it is right or wrong, you might knee-jerk reaction to things. And if you reply immediately after getting critique, whether it's good or bad, you are not ready to reply. You should, like, you know how they say that you should let a piece sit? That you should let things sit before editing them. You should do the same with every piece of critique that you receive. And there is no secret lesson actually, because the only way to get better at getting critique is to get critiqued. And if you react badly when people give you critique, you will not receive more critique, because a critique is a gift. And if, like, let's say you saw my comment here is something close to 600 words. Quite honestly, I probably put more effort into this comment than most people put into their posts. And if I give you such a gift and you tell me to screw off, to fuck off, then you are not going to get another piece of critique from me, you know? And that's also like what I said before, why you are not allowed to be mean. Because if you are mean to someone, then the person you are trying to give a gift to is yourself. You're trying to make yourself seem better rather than help another be the best poet or writer they can be. So empathy is basically what you need to have. Empathetic is what you need to be, both to receive and to give critique. And it is even more true in poetry, because poetry is about relating in emotions, like relating to others in your emotional capacity, or feeling what emotions another tries to transmit to you. Of course, there are more literary poets and poems that focus on just painting a picture, like the Grocery poem by Alison Carlson that Elaine shared with us a couple of days ago. But there is always an emotional layer that permeates poetry. So it behooves us all to care about others' emotional well-being when we read or write poetry or critique. And I think that's enough for my solo portion of the lesson, and we should be able to go and look at specific poems now.
I'm not sure I can always bring up empathy. I think I can bring up like real interest, but empathy is a layer that I'm not sure that I can open up for everyone, but I can still be gentle with someone even though I'm not completely empathetic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you are mixing sympathy and empathy. I think if you, like, even if you're not empathetic to the person, you should be empathetic to the writing, I mean. And I think if you can't be empathetic to someone when you are trying to give them critique, then you just shouldn't because like how can you actually like when I say empathy, I'm saying try to see where they are coming from when they wrote their piece. That's empathy. I'm not, like as I said in the beginning, I'm not just talking about be nice to them, be kind to them. I'm saying empathy is trying to see where someone is coming from.
Right. It's just, I guess we use the word differently. For me, like having interest in someone encompasses a lot of what you say. But for me, empathy just goes a little bit deeper, where I sort of let them under my skin completely in a way. So like I become them, and I don't do that with everyone.
That's sympathy. That's sympathy, basically. It's a semantic disagreement.
One question that I had, an observation when you were talking about, what's difficult about critique and the fact that critique hurts, or that it makes you feel something. One thing that I've noticed in the context of receiving critique is I really enjoy it. I really get a lot out of it. However, the whole aspect that you mentioned, that it's easier to say, okay, this doesn't work for me here, but however, providing actual solutions is more up to you as the author.
Yes. Or to
probably the worst part of the feeling for me is getting that critique and either agreeing with them or seeing where they're coming from, but then being uncertain as to how to address it.
Well,
or how to improve the piece.
But at the end of the day, first of all, like even if I point to you what you need to fix, you have to fix it. Like at the end of the day. And the second thing is, like most people just, as I said, like you can't actually trust them to tell you what the fix is on your piece.
So I also want to say, one of the biggest difficulties in getting a critique that you think is very pointed and spot on, but you don't feel like the parameters of the poem that you've written can actually contain kind of the good advice that you've gotten. I encourage people to understand that you don't have to necessarily go back and edit that piece for you to be taking that critique into mind. But as long as you keep it top of mind when you set out to outlining or creating new pieces, especially in the same direction, then you're growing, and that critique is helping you. And definitely take the time to acknowledge that. I know for guys, sometimes his critique on some of my pieces are on pieces that are older, or that I just don't have. I don't think that reworking them can even bring them to where I want them to be in light of some of the criticism that I've gotten, positive enforcement and critique criticism. So just remember that you can still grow in your future writing and future pieces just by being mindful of positive enforcement and critique going forward.
I really loved like the editorial critique, just because like he got into like the imagery, like that a thin blade is not really going to like do this, and this doesn't sound like the word you use there. That I really love that. Like that's really cool.
It's very in line with what a lot of poets, especially the ones that we have letters collected from, who had either mentors or kind of like collaborators during their time, would do, which is why it's a lot easier to do it, pre a piece being published, because as soon as it gets published, whether on Steam or anywhere else, it becomes something that's a little bit more fixed and difficult, it less of a like formless entity that you can kind of continue to shape and refine.
And it's also a bit ruder, like to go into a comment section and just like say, I don't like this word and this word and this word. And also from a technical point, like today when we have our text editors, it's much easier to do the editing feedback via text editor like Google Document than it is like to highlight and copy paste. It's just easier from a technical standpoint.
See, I have no qualms after publishing. Like if like I would see to edit something while it's still, you know, editable, or actually to republish and then just tell people exactly how the new edit came to place.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, but I'm talking like also more from the editor's perspective, because even if you are fine with it, like specifically, people don't feel comfortable doing that. You know, it's like part of like some people believe in the shit sandwich, as we call it, like wrapping the bad stuff in good. So a lot of people like don't like, even like people who edit poetry like on the Isle of Wight and on writer's block, while your piece is still in editing, they will tell you like let's say I don't like it, and a lot of these people will not say anything negative on a published piece in public. So like if you want to get better, you need to accept that you will get different critique before and after you publish something. Like yeah,
that's good to know.
Yeah, like I'm actually in the minority that I will tell you I don't like this stanza on a published piece, but I won't do it with strangers because a lot of people take this sort of thing wrong, and as I said, I mean my critique as a gift and I don't want people to be hurt. A lot of people won't give you this negative critique even if they do know you, even if you tell them that you can take it, because they don't feel comfortable giving this critique.
I can attest, because I'm one of those people, and it's even difficult with, I work as, I do some editorial critique for a few people here, including Guy's pieces every now and again, which I have some that I need to get to right now.
Two of them.
But it's very difficult for me. I will never, on a published piece, post almost anything negative. Even with somebody who, like Guy's poetry, which I work with regularly in the editorial process, even if it was one that I didn't work in the editorial process and it goes up and I see something negative, I'm probably not going to mention it. And so, you know, that's just a point and a testament to what Guy was saying.
Yeah, that's really interesting to know. I'm kind of with what Tiger said. I personally don't believe in anything ever being finished. So whether it's on the, I mean, if it was in a book, maybe if it was in a physical book that I was then distributing, I would feel differently. But just because something is published on the Steem blockchain to me doesn't mean anything. I just use the Steem blockchain as my journal to show my progress through things. But it's good to know that that other people may not know that I feel that way, or they still wouldn't want to, you know, give the editorial style of critique in the comments. That makes me want to take an extra layer and just, I guess, send pieces to people directly beforehand. That sounds really fun.
Well, you are a member on the Isle of Wight, which has rooms for that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we want, anyone has any more questions before we actually go to pieces?
Can you guys hear?
we're going to go to pieces.
Very quietly, Hazem.
Yeah, very quietly.
Okay, I want to say something about Isle of Wight.
Go ahead.
I used this workshop thing about 3 times, and I only published the result 2 times, third is hidden. First one was a poem, and I won a poetry contest with it. And the second was a short story that got couried when I posted.
Well,
So it's really something amazing to use that workshop.
though, let's be honest, workshops and the critique like I give, I keep saying it, you the writer do the work. An editor only gives you suggestions and is trying to make your piece be the best that you can make it, but it is your piece and your writing, and you own those things, not us.
Yeah, especially you don't really post your draft in a workshop with so much great writers if you don't feel it's really special.
Well, you shouldn't like worry about it. A piece is a piece.
My number one thing to give people kind of a background in when you're receiving feedback is you are the ultimate filter as the writer. So if anyone suggests something to you, it's coming from their understanding of your piece and their background as a writer and a reader and a critiquer. So keep in mind that the filter is you. So just because somebody says something doesn't mean it aligns with what you see or what your goals are with your poem or with your short story or your piece of literature. So don't, sometimes when Guy gives me critique, it's absolutely spot on and I try to incorporate it in. Sometimes he gives me critique and I'm like, this is a good point, but it doesn't align with what I'm trying to do. So you're the filter. Like Guy said, it's completely your work. You're getting other people's thoughts on it, which can give you a good, platform to see your work from different angles, but it's yours. And it's always going to be yours. And I like the phrase of just trying to make it the best that you can make.
Okay, so Tiger ran ahead, and this is her poem. She's going to read it to us.
Boy. Okay, give me a sec. Let me pull it up.
And I'm just going to say for a moment, actually after you read it to us out loud, I'm going to take a minute to read it in quiet, because this is another thing, not all of us process information the same way. I need to read to actually get things.
You're a visual
Yes.
absorber. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's important also to remember that that thing, but not everyone likes things the same. So if you upload a D-Sound poem, that's also one of the reasons I always encourage you to also write it down, because different people take in information in different ways. Okay, go ahead.
As complex constructed creatures, we seek patterns in surroundings, searching through our bare components to decipher and find grounding. So I ponder, sit and watch as mind runs a naked bellow, and the pills I will not touch offend doctors, moms, and fellows. As I squander borrowed minutes till the full of expiration, my mortality it pouts from its box of indignation. Be more lady, be more saint are the voices that I hear, for my elegance is quaint, and my boldness they all fear. Scrub the carpet, prep the scene, as my conscience poses clean, yet mere seconds in my nightmares from these notions thee would wean. Yes, my features they are pretty, and I smell of amber spice, but my brain is an inferno, and my closets are a fright. If you help me bury burdens, if you shield me from the sin, if you feed me more than paper and words thrust into the wind, I might tell you that I love you, I might even stay the night, but like madness I just flicker, and like bird I'm born to flight.
Okay. Anyone other than me wants to tackle the first one, or do you want... I'm not asking Tiger, I'm asking other people. Anyone wants to try and give us some feedback on this piece?
Yeah, I can try if I can have a second to read it over.
Yes, we are all going to take a minute to read it in silence. Daniel. Yo, begin.
No, this is a dense one. Actually, I really like the first stanza on this, but my eye caught on the word bear for some reason, because I thought there was a very interesting, complex constructed creatures with this alliteration, but it makes you picture, these really intricate beings, and then seek patterns in surrounding. So it's very external and internal. And then for some reason, my eye caught on bear components. It kind of struck me as
The opposite.
Yeah, the opposite, which could have been an intended paradoxical effect, or
Not
anyhow,
paradoxical, just contrasting.
yeah. And I found it interesting how from that stanza forward, it seemed that it transformed from more of a detached reflection into more personal and mundane, in a sense.
If you've read Tiger's other poems, I feel that the sense of the mundane is actually the poetic voice that she chose for herself. It might not be correct, but that's the impression I have gotten of her poems that I've gone over. If Elaine likes to be a voice of the shadows, and Dallas likes his passively constructed sentences, and you like your aesthetic lines, then I feel Tiger is the voice of the mundane. Yes, Elaine? Before we let Daniel continue?
Well, first off, I agree with you in that the pieces I've read of Tiger. One of the things I have for this poem is that just from a purely sonic standpoint, to start the poem with such, because C is a hard sound, and it's a very abrasive sense of alliteration to start the poem, which wouldn't be alliteration because it's not a vowel. I think it's consonation or something along those lines. But
it's alliterative, yeah, for our purposes.
Besides the point, yeah.
Yeah.
Starting it that way, and then also having kind of dipping in and out of internal rhymes throughout your lines actually makes the piece not read as fluidly, because you have this abrasive and very mentally engaging hard C's to start Tiger, and with sonically what you're trying to do as the piece goes, and I think the inconsistency of having less alliteration through on until you get to stuff like Barry Burdens and things like that makes that stand out to where it's actually kind of detracting from the piece as a whole, not just that section. And the other thing is that the internal rhyme in some areas and then not in other areas, while you haven't formatted it to where it's a 4-line stanza, a lot of them read that way, for better or for worse, probably because we gravitate towards that as a foundation for a lot of poetry. And it makes it seem like you're going in and out of rhymes, especially from a reading out loud standpoint. The only other thing that I would say is that I think that this piece would really benefit from, and I think some pieces do and some pieces don't, but I think this piece would really benefit from tighter punctuation, giving more focus on the breathing points, especially when you read it. It was different than I would have read it, but there was natural hard pauses there that I think are important to the tone and the cadence of the rhythm that you're setting with your piece.
Yeah, on that is something I feel like I imparted a bit to Elaine, because I really like punctuation. And if you remember what I told Daniel a few days ago, I believe that formatting is a tool you bring to the piece, and that means punctuation is an important tool in your piece. People, just like the title, when I commented earlier on Dallas's piece where I said child's play the title, and then you suddenly give me blood, and I think And I told him that's not the image I had in my mind. Like until Blood, I thought this was like just toys playing, which is what it turned out to be in the end. But everything in the piece, including the title and the photo you choose and the punctuation, actually impact the piece. So those things in poetry are not besides the point. They are part of the point. Daniel, do you want to continue?
I want to comment. Yes, I want to continue, and I also want to comment on that because as someone who just started writing poetry and at first had the impression that, oh, poetry means, there should be little or no punctuation. Going from there to over the years of writing, realizing, actually, I really love punctuation to be specific. And I was a bit chagrined whenever I got that feedback from you, because that was something that I normally would pay close attention to. I must have just been tired at that time. I think it's very important, and it's important to be consistent too. So perhaps it's personal. I know a lot of people that don't use much or any punctuation in poetry, and the times that I've seen it work the best are when there are very short lines. Like some of Mamadini's pieces come to mind, which I hope we can convince her to come to class someday, because she has an interesting approach to poetry, and I'd like to hear from it. Anyway, that's kind of a deep topic to get into, punctuation in poetry. But just continuing on from what I was saying, this is more of a speculative thing, but I feel like when I was listening to Elaine talk about, kind of this complexity and these hard sounds right at the beginning of this piece, in a certain way, to me, those two first lines kind of represent like a psychological barrier that the author would put to someone, that if they weren't willing to get through those first two lines, then they're not worthy of reading like the more personal sort of reflections that are more easy to understand in the next three lines. And the two longer couplets, which, as Alain said, these really read as quatrains to me. But anyway, they're formed as long couplets. Once you get to the second long one, which would be the fifth one, this is where I feel it. Yes. This is where it seems to transition again back to a similar, more complex sentiment as the beginning to me in the second line. I find this line very interesting. However, I don't understand it. Yet mere sickens in my nightmares from these notions thee would wean. That, but that seems to tie back to the beginning.
It types back to the actually to the carpet. Basically, it's like I'm saying, I prep the scene and etc. And I present innocent, but basically, if you looked into my nightmares, you'd have a different view of my innocence. It has a lot to do with my psychology and my duality.
So basically,
mental state.
So basically, you're saying that they would win of you, not win you, because that line could be read both ways.
Well, the notion of me being innocent, of that notion, basically they would be weaned of that notion the minute they would see what goes on in my nightmares.
I see.
And it's also later you see when I say my closets are
don't give away too much. We are not done yet, Tiger.
All right.
Okay, Daniel, do you have like some holistic feedback on the piece?
Let me see.
I'll have my go afterwards.
Yeah, I'll let you go pretty quickly because I'm not very, I don't have much experience with knowing how to put this, but I do feel like for me, I saw what Alain was saying. For me, I felt that the beginning and ending were both really strong. I felt that the beginning pulled me into the piece, and then it kind of... Another thing I wanted to mention that I don't know if was intentional, but I found really quite interesting was how in the rhymings of the first 4 lines, it was surroundings rhyming partially with the singular grounding, and then singular bellow rhyming with the plural fellows. I found that really interesting because a lot of times people use those type of rhymes where it's mixed between plural and singular. It seems like sloppy or unintentional, but here it had me wondering if this was actually intentional because of how patterned it was. I found it fascinating. That pulled me in to the piece, and as I was listening to her read it, it really flowed well, and I found the mix of the kind of cleanliness and this sense of awareness and clarity being contrasted with this more subtle hint of darkness that is behind the scenes, which was really interesting and an interesting change from some of the pieces I've read of Tiger that are more, the darkness is on full display. So I actually really enjoyed this piece, and I thought it was well done in that sense of subtlety, with the darkness being layered on top of this kind of luminosity. So that's what I'll say on it.
Okay. Alain, do you have anything you want to say overall of the piece before I go?
I do.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Whoever spoke.
Yeah. I was trying to pull the piece up and look at it while I speak. So if you just give me a second, because I got to change my mic setting on my phone.
I'll read what Live Russian said in chat in the meanwhile. The pills I will not touch offend doctors. This line is quite a rebellion, like, I don't care if I die. It's, in my experience, and I might be projecting, but again, when you read things, you always read yourself into them. It is more about rebelling against the necessity of the pills you are told you need than saying you don't care if you die, but that's just my take. Okay, what do you have to say, Steve?
All right. I just had a couple observations, and this could be my taste or whatever, but the formatting, the centered formatting, I think it might do it justice to try something else with this piece. It may or may not work, but for me, it's almost a little distracting. And also, at the very end, the first part of the poem seems to be a kind of a reflection and a laying out there of what's going on internally inside the narrator. And then the last seems to switch a little bit to speaking to somebody, especially when the thee is added, these notions thee would wean. And then after that, it's kind of like a warning. And for me, it almost feels like maybe that element's not a complete thought or isn't fully fleshed out because of everything that comes before it. I don't know if I really don't know if it would help to flesh it out more, but something just seems a little disconnected between the parts. So I don't know, maybe some thought and thinking about that, and if there's anything that could be put into it to make it more connected or something like that. And I also agree about just going through and maybe messing with some of the punctuation, capitalization. I think that goes along with if you tried a different formatting to help. And that's about it. That's all I got to say.
Okay. Alain, your turn. After you, we will see if there's anyone else.
I just wanted to note that for Tiger and her poetry, a lot of times, like Guy said, the voice that I gravitate towards identifying in her when I'm reading her pieces is one of seeing the connections between mundane activities and larger, almost the symbolic nature of addressing them or not addressing them. A lot of times it's the rejection of a expectation being placed upon her, or an expectation being placed, and the shirking of kind of societal or even familial parameters placed upon the narrator as a person, which I take to be Tiger a lot of times herself. Because of this, this is the reason why some of these lines read really close to this voice, and some of them read far away from it, which is why I get, as I've read more of the disjointed feel from this piece as I get. As much as I like the wording in the first stanza, the first couplet, it feels disjointed from the rest, similar to what Daniel was identifying earlier, and it's because it has a different voice. Whereas I think that would be stronger in a piece that is more reflective on that. And while I understand the importance of that to the deconstructing of the self as a preface, as I read more through this piece, I think that there's places where that, if that's the goal of the piece, is kind of this identification of what you see of me, I may not be, and the expectations you give to me are not ones that I'm going to impose on myself unless I believe in them myself. And some of those come through really strong, and some of the lines I think are just kind of there to connect to the next part. So my overarching critique from 20,000 feet would be to look at the lines and see what aligns with the vision of the piece, what you want to impart, because I think some take away from that as the central message, if that is indeed the central message.
Anyone else wants to have a go? Okay, so now my take. I will begin with a bit of editing critique. Not a lot, because, as I said, it's actually a bit hard to do it not while you are reading and actually coloring the lines. But as everyone else said, complex constructed creatures is a very strong alliteration, and you open with it. That's like a great opener, but the fact that you then don't continue the alliteration actually makes the entire piece read weaker than if you had not opened with this alliteration that we now expect. So here is something that the second thing is more general and strong advice to anyone who thinks of writing with rhymes. You have to be careful to make sure that the lines don't feel as if you only wrote the line for the rhyme. And if you break a rule, and my stance on rules in poetry is that you can break them, but you have to actually have a reason to do it. There are lines here that don't rhyme, like spice and fright, and if you don't rhyme, it has to be like you are breaking the flow for a reason. Do you want us to stop on this line in particular? I think not, because this couplet is actually one of the weaker ones in the piece, and sin and wind is a near rhyme. So if you rhyme, first of all, make sure you actually consistently rhyme, and if you don't, it has to have a reason. And usually I will do it only like in the last stanza, and I won't go to non-rhyme and then back to rhyming. That's a bit much, again, unless if you have a really good reason to do it, which I don't feel is the case here. Let's look at a couple of, like, be more lady, be more saint. That's an example of something that I would point out with a question mark, because that's not proper English. Be more ladylike, be more of a saint. But this is an example of something that I would accept where you bend the rules of grammar, because this is more poetic. So this is fine. We would win is what we call rhyme-led. Rhyme-led is when you basically butcher a line just so it would fit the rhyme, because you use the word you several times at the last stanza, for instance. And why do you use the if you actually use you later? You do it because otherwise the sentence would see from these notions would win you, and you would win, and this is an example of rhyme-led. Another example is, as I squander borrowed minutes till the full of expiration, my mortality it pouts from its box of indignation. I like the sound of his lines, but it's not like, and the expiration and mortality is nice, but the box of indignation feels a bit of a word that is just there for the rhyme. And there are a couple of other places here, like especially the second stanza. So I ponder, sit and watch as my mind runs in naked bellows, and the pills I will not touch offend doctors, mums, and fellows. So like the doctors, mums, and fellows, it feels like a bad line. There's just no other way to say it. Like, I feel like if you had closed the line after the word doctors, it would have been fine. But the doctors, mums, and fellows is more than a bit much here. At the last line, you need an A before the word bird, because it's like a bird, not like bird. I read the second line in the final stanza. Notice that it has no punctuation. It throws you out. This is something I would again point out, but would actually approve of, because if you feed me more than paper and words thrust into the wind, like, look at the meaning of this line. This line is about the rush, about rushing into the wind, about having an endless tumble of words. So I'm fine with this line, like going and going and going, but you should at least be conscious that this is something you are doing, and decide if it is actually what you want to be doing. To go over the piece as a whole, I agree with Elaine. Like, I feel that you felt this piece needed to have additional lines. Yes, my features, they are pretty and I smell of amber spice, but my brain is an inferno and my closets are a fright. That's like, the fact that your brain is an inferno is something that you are telling us here, which is doubly worse because you've already shown it to us in everything that came prior. So why are you telling it to us again? And I feel like you don't actually, like the part about your features and your smell, I just feel like it doesn't actually add anything to the core message of a piece. So I would like, so and to top it all, it has no rhyme, so like that couplet I would just like cut entirely. Everything that doesn't add to a poem detracts. So that's an example. And I think that you also, there's an interesting switch here. You go from talking of yourself and how others speak of you to finally speaking to someone. I do like it, but I almost wonder if we could have used like another couplet or a hanging line about the other one, or the penultimate line in the piece. I feel like that should have been personally the final piece, because it's a good way to end the you section and provide the contrast to how society sees you. I might tell you that I love you, I might even stay the night. Like, that's a nice way to end it. But the fact that you don't end it there but go back is also fine, but it gives an entirely different message that perhaps society, so to speak, was right, because you go back to running away. And that would be an example of my critique of both sorts on this. It's like, I could say some more about the pills and on being a lady, but like not I think that's sufficient. Tiger, if you have something to say, you can say, but like as I intimated earlier, I believe that like responding to critique immediately is not necessarily the right way to tackle feedback.
I find a lot of what you guys said interesting. To explain a few things, the reason I structured this, it's probably because it's the odd way I talk to myself. I tend to have different voices in my head, if that makes sense. Basically, and they are all me, but they're not all interconnected. So like when I first start out as being more what you guys say is more aloof, it's more my observer that's basically leading. It's basically all talking to this person, but it's my different voices talking to this person, like the observer leading into sort of the conversation, and then because the other ones are less emotionally involved in a way, and then the emotion, and finally like the emotionally involved part of me gets how do I say, strong enough or less timid enough to actually come out and say something. I do see where some of the lines might or could use with some cutting. Not sure if I'm going to do it yet. I'm going to have to sit on that one, like you said. I do see where I have punctuation issues, but I have punctuation issues, period, because I speak so many languages or pieces of so many languages that my whole grammatic instrument is a complete disaster. So I am very thankful for any kind of, hints to that. And when it comes to the last two sentences, yes, I can see where it's more positive to end like I might say the night, but that last sentence is basically a thing of, I'd like to stay the night, but knowing myself, I might run away. And I do see where you say that like a bird, it's not English. So I'm probably not going to do a bird because it will break the flow, but I'll probably make it a plural. And then that is probably going to be, that's more English. So
Yes.
Thank you very much for the critique. It really was helpful. And I really do love being, you taking the time to do this. And please feel free to thump me again.
Yeah, it's more that like this, like if you see my comments, they usually take 20 to 30 minutes and a lot of energy and inspiration, because like I said, critique is also an art, and it's so I'm limited in how many pieces I do a day.
I didn't say you have to do it
Yeah,
every
yeah.
day.
I'm just like saying like, so also like be aware that this is something I told Elaine, that when he told me yesterday or the day before that he's looking for inspiration. You spend your inspiration when you read other people's poetry and give them critique. So
Yeah.
this is something to keep in mind, that you have a limited amount of inspiration or energy, and yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and at the very least, it has to be recharged.
Yes.
So,
So who wants to be the next to share their piece?
I'll just volunteer that if no one else does, we could look at the piece that you already looked at the other day if you want, Guy. Because I went and fixed the few punctuation things there.
Yeah, and the typos I
But
pointed out to you.
Yeah, and the typos, but I didn't yet implement any of the other changes. So anyway, I just wanted to say if no one else
No, so you're next, Hazem.
could use that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hazem Linkas? And because Hazem's microphone is a bit low, no, you're next, Hazem. we already half went over Daniel's piece. So because Hazem's microphone is a bit low, I'm volunteering Elaine to read it for us. It's not because I don't like Hazem's voice, it's just that his microphone is really low today.
It's because we like Hazem's voice too much, and
Yeah.
sometimes he reads it and distracts you from the words because you're like, oh, that voice. You got
I
it.
don't want to be annoying here every day I read something.
So I'm giving this a quick speed read to make sure I get the pacing right. So this is called You Need to Do Yourself That Service. It is linked in the Steemitschool chat for anyone curious, and if you want to read along. When it rains, it is too wet. When it doesn't, it is too hot. When he's poor, he is too needy. When he's rich, he is too greedy. When she's young, she's ignorant. When she's strong, she's dominant. She's either wicked and mean, or she is a drama queen. What is good is surely a lie, says every single judging eye. They think you're only what they see, even if you don't agree. But you're the one who should define who you are and draw the line. Between your bottom and your surface, you need to do yourself that service.
Okay, Elaine, you're going to give a first critique. I'm volunteering you, yes.
So I think something that I identify really quickly is that this poem reads somewhat limericky. That's partially because of your rhyme, and what a limerick is it's kind of a lot of times it's a rhyming poem that contains some wisdom that's imparted with some pretty straightforward words. Here, I think what's really great about your writing and what you do here is the way that you kind of have a very focused direction, and you make sure that you kind of work towards that. And your end lines are always really good summations, which you've done well here, talking about doing yourself the service of acknowledging that you are the only one who should be defining yourself. Now, in that context, I think this is another piece that I would really love to see more punctuation. Reading it without punctuation was actually a little bit difficult, and that's why I had to kind of speed read ahead of myself while I was reading to make sure that I was getting the pacing right. There's places where there's natural commas, like short pauses, and there's places where you need that long pause of a period or a semicolon to allow you to I think, be kind of guided through what you're talking about, Hazem. The other thing is, I really like the second stanza in context of your piece, only if it's tongue-in-cheek, which I think it is. I think if it isn't, then it detracts pretty greatly from your message. So just as a quick note, talking about the strong woman. The other thing is, in that stanza 3, they think you are only what they see, is probably the only line I really got tripped up on, just because the meter changes there. I haven't taken enough time to analyze it, but the meter changes from some of your other lines, so it was one where I had to kind of struggle to fit all the words in. And I think possibly the UR contraction was part of that, but I haven't taken enough time to break that down. So those are my quick kind of initial thoughts.
Mm-hmm. And don't you have, like, I'm going to point it out before, the first 2 lines don't rhyme.
Yeah.
Like, and okay, who else wants to critique before? I will go last again. I just wanted to point it out.
Yeah.
But the first 2 lines.
I've got some things.
Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah. So this one's a good example of one to go over in critique because since it's so short and it's very structured, so I appreciate you offering this one for us to look at. I think it's a good example. I do like, I like, okay, when it's raining, it's too wet, when it doesn't, too hot, poor, he's too needy, rich, he's too greedy, kind of showing how, to me, it kind of shows how there's always complaining no matter what. And that's all good. I like those 4 lines. I completely agree on the punctuation, how much of a wonder it would do to even alternate commas and periods there, since the first 2 are one thought and the second 2 are another thought, or even using semicolons potentially, depending on what you like. Now, the second stanza, to me, felt out of place for one reason was before you got to dominant, everything else had a pretty clear-cut negative connotation, like something being too wet, too hot, too needy, or too greedy, ignorant. But dominant to me is more of a neutral word.
It's even positive, usually, I would say.
Yeah, or positive. Except for maybe in the context of the whole cultural expectation of a woman not being dominant. But to me, that didn't come through clear enough. So that's why dominant felt odd. And then the 3rd and 4th lines, I wasn't able to understand what they meant in the context of this piece. I wasn't able to get that. So then after this, what is good is surely a lie, says every single judging eye. I like this part, but then the ending part, they think you're only what they see, even if you don't agree. I think that this might be an example of what Guy was talking about something being rhyme-led. You seemed like you needed to use the word agree, and the reason why I say that is that doesn't feel like the exact meaning that you might want to convey, because it doesn't really matter if you agree what you are, but you are what you are. So it's less that you don't agree with what they see as you just aren't what they see. So that's what I have to say there. And then I actually really liked the ending stanza, because I think one of your strengths is being able to bring a strong summary of everything. And I completely agree with what Alain was saying. One of your poetic strengths is having almost a laser focus through your piece and a very intentional message that you're trying to convey or explore and then come to a conclusion on. And yeah, a punctuation throughout this piece would be really helpful. And this also brings me to at least bring up the question of also capitalization in poetry. And I know people have different views there as well, with the most primary view being that each line ought to be capitalized in poetry. That's one view.
I find that actually distracting, because I expect, when I see a capitalized word, I either expect it to be extra meaningful as a proper noun, or I expect it to be the beginning of a sentence. So if you have a hanging line, a line that goes over a sentence that goes over 2 lines, and you capitalize the first word in the second line, in my mind it inserts an additional heartbreak, when I read those poems. That's why
Okay.
I capitalize by the grammatical rules myself.
I see. Yeah, I've been instructed basically the opposite. Just, okay, capitalize every line. So I don't know enough to know what the different schools of thought are there, but I don't know how I feel about no capitalization whatsoever. Anyway, those are my kind of reflections.
Anyone else wants to have a go? Tiger, perhaps?
No.
Okay, so I will go now. First of all, the title, I don't like it because this line doesn't read so much as English. It's I can't pinpoint exactly why, or even say that it's incorrect, but it's a line that you stumble on grammatically. Continue with the editing, like obviously that also applies to the last line of the piece. The first two lines don't rhyme, which I think is an issue if the rest of the piece does rhyme. Ignorant and dominant, and especially the dominant line, here is something like that no one commented on. Notice that in the first two lines he goes, it is, not it's. And then we have he is. So that fits, and when he's rich, he is too greedy. That fits. When she's young, she is ignorant. So that again is not something that is right or wrong, but something to note. I actually don't disagree with it because the earlier lines are shorter, so this helps keep the flow of the piece more consistent. But ignorant and dominant are all they are free vowels, ignorant, and dominant, whereas earlier everything was a single vowel. Mean, queen, lie, I, see, agree. And like at the end we get to be two vowels, like agree, define, surface, service, which is again service, surface is not a rhyme. But I feel that the free vowel rhyming is a bit too heavy, especially after how light and short the first stanza has been. I actually really like the third stanza. You might like trying disagree instead of don't agree, though I agree, they think you only what they see. I actually do like that line, because I feel there's a flow there that is good, but the final, like, but you're the one who should define who you are and draw the line. I feel that, and she's either wicked and she's either wicked and mean, or she's a drama queen. I feel like those are the places that flow the best. I don't like the bottom and surface. Like you use the images of water, so it helps shape it a bit, but there's actually no water imagery aside from the first line. So I think there's bottom and surface, because bottom only works if you're talking of a sea, of a pool of water. So I think that comes out of nowhere, and those words don't necessarily track well in imagery. And the last line, I think, like, needs to be a bit reworked in terms of grammar. So it's not exactly incorrect. It's just people like don't say that. You need to do yourself that service. People don't actually say that. But if you say that like Russian, then the surface of the hat. I actually like the piece quite a bit. I thought it had a nice cadence to it, a nice flow. There's not too much for me to say, aside from, dominant doesn't fit. Like most of the things I think you need to edit here are on the editing and not on the impressionist level for this piece. No, Elaine, she knows. She's asking maybe I meant the bottom of a C. I understood Hazem, but I'm saying that you didn't actually use the metaphor of the C for it to actually fit here. You know, you actually need to use the metaphor of the C for this line to fit here. Okay, Hazem, do you want to respond? And if you do, please raise your volume a bit.
No, actually, I prefer not to respond right now.
Okay, that's
Just
fine.
enjoying hearing you guys.
Okay. So, does someone else have anything to say to Hazem, or should we have time, I guess, for one more piece? Which, if no one else comes to the fore, will be Daniel, which I actually already went over his piece and gave him critique. So
Or I have one that I haven't actually posted yet that's shorter.
okay,
But if someone else wants to go, then they can take precedence.
you don't need a mic. Link us. Pingses. Elaine would be asked to read it again. Okay.
So I'll read this. If you hear things being knocked over in the background, it's because my cat is knocking things off of shelves.
Male or female cat?
Female.
Okay. What's her name? Before we go.
Zarko.
Zarko. Okay.
You letting her starve again? You're not rubbing her for 3 hours? Evil, evil here.
I know.
Okay. By the way, before we go to this piece, I'm going to give everyone listening a suggestion. Everyone, like, you know how people like constraints because they help them find inspiration and structure their pieces? My biggest suggestion to any beginning poet would be to not use rhymes, because there are more pitfalls than just let the lines say what they need to say. Don't worry over much over how it sounds, worry over the content. And like I tell people who write books and stories, like the worst thing you can do is worry about your font and your spacing and things like that. The first thing you need to do is write the piece, and then you can worry about the things that make it prettier. And I feel like the subservience to rhyming is the biggest thing new poets need to unlearn. Okay, Elaine, you're up.
I like that point. So this is a poem by Pinksess. If anybody wants to read along with me, it is currently linked in Steemitschool live class on the Discord, and this is called Reflection. Pale image of the youth, an echo of a sad truth, mind with extreme agitation, soul that has 1,000 reasons. Teardrop blurred the past, illusions that never last, shadows in a blink of an eye, memories are in my heart. Portrait of our exaltation, empowered with full emotion, feeling of pure joy and bliss, now I vaguely reminisce. Misty and smoky, I can't see it clearly, bleary eyes that made me realize it was a reflection of mine.
Okay, now we'll take a few seconds to read it in quiet because most people need that. Steve, do you want... No, Steve isn't with us here on sound. Okay. Who wants to go first? Like, on this piece, I mean. Ah, Steve is back. Elaine? Okay. Daniel, do you want to go? Testing. Okay.
Yeah, sure. I'll just say some basic things. First, on the editing side, echo in the second line. Need to remove the E at the end of it. Let me keep looking for a second here.
Okay. I hope we'll have time for you, Steve, but right now we're going over Pinks's piece. By the way, a mod need to add Pinks's to that because it seems she's part of a challenge and she's not marked as part of a challenge on Discord.
Actually, she is in the beginner category. I just checked.
Ah, okay.
Where do you mean?
Yeah, okay. No, I see. The color is light for poetry beginner, so it looks like
Yeah.
unrolled person. Okay, before you guys go, I will say a couple of meta things. I would recommend not having two images before your piece, because you want your piece to be front and center. You can have the images after. In general, I do not like GIFs, especially not to the side, because while your eyes go from the end of one line to the start of the other line, the GIF, the movement distracts you and makes it a bit harder for you to go to the next line. Like, that's things I would recommend to anyone who blogs. I've been blogging for many years, so these are things I would recommend to avoid. Before, I will give a few more editing notes before Daniel and Elaine are back. Pale image of the youth. Youth, if you remove the word the, it talks about youth as a concept. The youth means a young person or people. So you have to decide which image you are trying to actually raise here. So 1,000 reasons, because 1,000 is singular, even if reasons is a plural, so it's 1,000. By the way, notice that you I'll keep this for my part later, but I notice that in the first two stanzas you rhyme the first two lines only. In the third stanza you rhyme 2 and 2. In the last one you have a rhyme in the first two lines. You sort of rhyme within the third line, and you don't rhyme the last line. I actually think not rhyming in the last line is fine, because it sort of strikes the end, but your rhyming structure between stanzas is inconsistent, and I would be against that in general. Like, it's fine breaking the rules, but there's a difference between breaking the rules and not following rules. Okay, hopefully Daniel or Elaine are ready now.
Yeah, I'm ready to
Okay.
look at a few things here. So on a holistic level, I did find it an interesting piece. Kind of fascinating how there was a strong sense of pure, very positive emotions. You know, it talks about pure joy and bliss, but there's also a sense of melancholy. You know, there's an echo of a sad truth. And I will also echo what Guy said about the first line. I would consider deciding if it should be changed to pale image of youth, if you're trying to talk about the concept of youth, because pale image of the youth means a specific person, a youth. So I would consider maybe removing the, depending on what you're going for there. Yeah, again, add soul that has 1,000 reasons. And okay, now the biggest things I was seeing here, and I did see the inconsistent rhyme structure as well. That's something maybe to look at. But aside from that, just in the actual meaning of the second stanza, teardrop blurred the past, illusions that never last, shadow in a blink of an eye. That is a thought there, semi-cohesive, but then memories are in my heart does not seem to fit with that. Maybe the sentiment of it could.
It
but
actually
the way that-
contradicts it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to fit with that. So if you are going for something paradoxical, anyhow, it seemed to stick out to me. And then the same thing for me happened with the third stanza, because you have portrait of our exaltation, empowered with full emotion, feeling of pure joy and bliss. This is like very transcendent. This is energetic. But then you seem to contradict it and say, now I vaguely reminisce. But vaguely reminiscing, maybe you meant that you had all these strong feelings and that in the actual reminiscence of them, they became vague because of the vagaries of memory.
Or
Not
that she
sure,
almost
but-
forgot them. It used to be strong, but
Yeah.
now it's weak.
That does actually make more sense. So one of the second stanza was what bothered me the most. Those are my biggest notes, I think, that I saw.
Okay, Elaine, are you here again?
Yeah, I wasn't 100% sure what all was talked about because I missed a chunk. But the one thing I want to say is I love, even though I barely write it, I love poetry. And I think you do create some strong emotional appeals in this place, in this poem. But I was going to comment too on there's a few grammar changes that could really help with just the kind of the flow of the piece. The short 2 lines right before your last line, as a reader, tripped me up a little bit. Those could be separated so that it doesn't feel quite as
Detached.
like a change in the cadence. But I think that the biggest thing here is that there's, just because of the English, there's a couple of contrasting thoughts that don't work together, which as I can tell, I think both Guy and Daniel have identified. But I really like, and people probably talked about this already, but I really like you're working with some really good images here. And you can see that where you're coming from is a very emotionally charged area, and it comes through in your words. So I think that that's really important and is something that you should definitely continue to take heart on, and it's an obvious strength.
Okay, so now I'll go. And this is like an example of why the writer has to make the decision, because I'm going to actually contradict Elaine in some of the things. But before that, if I go back to the third line, like in the second stanza, I'm fine with the rhyme to not rhyme, shadow, because it reads fine, but mind with extreme agitation, that line just kills the flow, like it sits in my mouth like a rock, and you actually have to rework that line, because it's fine as the last line of stanza, or maybe the entire piece, but not as something that follows immediately in a rhyme and then you go to another rhyme. It's too much. In general, if you have lines with if you have G's and D's that are hard, they tend to break the flow of speaking. Like, try reading it out loud and you'll see. Like, you could hear it when Elaine read it. I think you need to unpack your images a bit more. You repeat things a bit too much and don't unpack them to the level that I think you are telling us rather than showing. Teardrop blurred the past, illusions that never last, that's great. But what are the illusions? Shadow in a blink of an eye is just repeating the same message again. Memories are in my heart sort of explains it, but again, you are telling us where they are. You are not actually dealing with the image. Portrait of our exaltation, empowered with full emotion, like thing of pure joy and bliss, those 3 lines, each of them is telling us. Each of them should be either the first or the last line, with the other 2 lines telling us what is the exaltation. Empowered with full emotion. What is empowered with full emotion? The thing of pure and joy and bliss. What is the thing of pure joy and bliss? The portrait of our exaltation. Each of these lines is just repeating the saying. Like, it's not like Elaine and many others like would tell you that it is fine because you are repeating the message and you are making it clear how strong it was. But that's the only thing you are doing. You are telling us this is strong. You are not telling us exactly what is strong or why it is strong. Why is your youth such a strong emotion, so vivid to you, or was? You're just telling us that it was. And like I feel like each stanza sort of says the same thing without adding enough. So I would like to see like if I were giving you a pre-publication advice, I would have said that you should keep one of those stanzas and use the other 2 to explore, or add an exploration stanza between each of these 2, which would bookend it. Like you would say, this felt so strong and now it's gone, and then you would tell us where it's gone or what it was, and then you repeat again the cycle of reminiscence. And now for those only listening to the recording, Pinkses is writing her reply in the chat. Which reminds me, I should copy the links because I'm planning to publish the audio later, so people will be able to go over the poems we've gone over.
Yeah, and I do want to just say thanks to everyone who is willing to have their piece looked at, because it's not always the most comfortable to be under the magnifying glass, but I think that everyone had a really good attitude with it, and it was really educational
and also,
me as well.
Yeah, and also thanks to everyone who gave critique, because speaking in class is also putting yourself under the microphone. Under the microscope.
And the microphone, yeah. on the microphone, under the microscope, under the magnifying glass.
Yeah.
And yeah, obviously I want to say thank you so much to Guy for coming and doing this, and hopefully even being able to do this on a weekly basis if we can work it out. Because I think that anyone who's in this class, please hype this up to other people that don't join, because I think that the more that people will participate in this kind of forum, then the quick progress that they'll see in their writing, and the quicker progress that we'll see kind of on building up the community.
Thank you for reminding me. There was one last thing that I actually wanted to talk about with critique and poetry and getting better. Like it is sort of a meta topic, but it is important when it comes to critique, especially. People only get so much better by doing something. Let's say you start painting and you keep painting on your own, and nobody ever sees your painting, and you just paint. You will only get so much better. The point here is not actually the critique. What helps you get better is being mindful of what you are doing. It is reflecting on what you've done, what you felt was not good enough, what you did like. It is the striving to get better that helps you actually get better faster. It is being mindful about all things. Like if I take an example from gaming like StarCraft or Magic the Gathering, if you just play, you will get better from for technical reasons. But if you actually after a game sit and go over what you've done, think about your decisions, why you've done things, that's how you actually get much better. Critique, what it teaches you is like when you critique others, it tells you, as I said earlier, it teaches you to look at the cadence of words, at the meaning of a word for the bigger image. It teaches you the tools you need to actually reflect on your pieces to get better as a writer, as someone who writes anything, not just poetry.
For sake of the recording, if anybody was wondering what Princess is typing, what she typed then, because of course they're not going to be able to see the chat.
Right.
She said, "Noted, thank you. Sometimes I'm really having a hard time having a new topic, and most of the time I ended with full emotion type of poetry." So that's what she had to say.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for letting people know if they weren't able to see that, if they're just listening to the recording. And I did want to add on to a little bit of what Guy said on a more speculative note. Why do people tend to just do things and get somewhat better? But why do people have such difficulty in convincing themselves to step back and have the more analytical side that actually allows them to get better faster?
There are many reasons.
Yeah, part of it, I feel that there's actually a psychology of being intimidated of your potential, being intimidated of what you could actually achieve, and feeling more comfortable to just remain kind of in the patterns that you're in rather than shake them up. But yeah, what did you have to say there, Guy?
There are many reasons. First of all, like if you're talking about poetry, Moe knows, which is a poet on Steemit, calls it the silence. Like the poetry I wrote between 2002 and 2009, which is something akin to 60 pieces, got less feedback than a single one of my pieces gets these days. Many of us come from circles where a lot of people, like even here, like many people feel unequipped to critique poetry, so they don't. And that means that if you write poetry, even if you show it to people, you might just not actually get feedback. And another thing is, it's actually hard. Like even if you look at like a game like Hearthstone or StarCraft, one of the reasons the top is the top is because they are willing to take the effort, and it is an effort, and some people want to treat the hobby as just a hobby, not as something that they put effort in. Other people like didn't train their critical faculties, like they keep telling themselves, I can't critique, and to get better you need to critique yourself. And it's easier to say, I'm not good at critique, so I won't critique. And I'm not sure people are afraid of their potential so much as they're afraid of hurting their emotions, which is why they don't ask other people for critique. And also, like, let's say, on Steemit in particular, like Daniel knows it. Let's be honest, most of the comments Daniel is a good example because he gets a lot of comments and a lot of votes, and most of his comments are great piece, I loved it. And that does not, people, like we spoke about it earlier, people are not only not comfortable receiving negative feedback, they are also not comfortable giving it, which means how do you get better when people don't tell you that you need to get better? And it's really hard for most people to edit themselves, which is why, like, every time, like, everyone who went to college, they tell you, ask someone else to go over your piece to find typos, because you can't edit yourself, because you know what you meant rather than what you wrote. And it is actually harder to critique yourself and critique others, which is why, like, even I, like, go and ask people like Elaine and others for feedback on my pieces, not just for the additional points of view, but because even for me, it is harder to critique yourself.
Yeah, and I would say there is some merit in practicing a craft without focusing on getting feedback if you're just kind of building up your chops.
Yeah.
But when you get to a certain point, like I feel that I'm now at that point for myself with writing. I did not feel like I was at that point when I started on Steemit and just wanted to get my writing habit down. But now I feel really like I would love to get more editing feedback because, as you said, I mean, at a certain point, how are you actually going to get better other than just doing the same thing over and over?
Yes.
And having a different perspective, yet you can't look at your own piece and objectively critique it because it's too close to you.
Well, just to say, nobody is going to critique anyone objectively because there is no such thing as objective critique. I just want to
Right.
get it out there, which
Yeah.
is important because some people think there is, but just isn't. But yeah, I also do agree with you. You have to get the basics down on your own because you have to, like, you can't explain to someone how to mix paint before they know that you can mix paint. Like, people have to actually know how paint works before you can start talking to them about different textures and things like that. And it is like that with poetry. Like, people have to actually be able to write a bit for you to give them pointers. I'm going to actually say what Yahia, who is listening and is a published poet, had to say. One way to get professional critique at a later level is to try and get published, because hopefully the magazines you send your poetry to will give you more feedback than just rejected, usually. And it's true.
Really, they won't just put a huge red stamp rejected on your
Hopefully
piece
not.
and send it back.
It also depends where you submit, because like if you submit to the New York Times, for instance, they will Hazem, we are hearing you kissing someone.
Actually, that was amazing.
Yeah.
Whatever just happened.
It was kissing a baby, yeah. So, yeah, like, it depends on the publication and how, like, the New York Times probably will just give you a rejection. Actually, they tell you if you hadn't heard from us in 6 months, you probably got rejected, because it depends on their load. Yeah, but it's worth a shot, you know? And you usually don't submit to only one place, because most publications allow simultaneous publication, submission to multiple publications.
I've never really thought of like publishing the conventional way. I mean, like most of my poetry ended up on walls most of my life, and now the past few years I've been sort of like just, writing it down in blogs and things like that. I don't even know where I would send my stuff to.
Well, I'm actually working on that these days, so I will, after I'm done with it a bit, maybe I'll write a post linking outlining the process of trying to get published in poetry to help other hopefuls, shall we say.
I would have one question for you, which is, what recommendation would you make, since we're in the midst of this challenge and we're kind of trying to output quite a bit, it does make it difficult to figure out how to actually receive feedback before posting it. What would you recommend in this kind of situation to, what would you recommend there?
What I would recommend is either you join a community like the Isle of Wight or the Writer's Block. You basically need to prepare at least a day in advance. You basically need to have today's poem done and write tomorrow's poem or or the day after, and expect and hope you get feedback within 24 hours and then actually have the time to implement it. There's like the only real way to do it, like maybe when you have a day off, don't actually take a day off, write a poem and submit it to a circle that does critique, or meet people here in the challenge and ask them to form a feedback circle with you. Like 4 or 5 people is a good amount, and like and always be 1 or 2 days ahead. And that way, there is like you can't rely on like there are no tricks. That's the only thing you can really do. Just fit in another poem into one of the days and then try to be a day ahead.
Yeah, great. And with the feedback that you do on Isle of Wight, how would you do it if a poem is using odd formatting, something that would only appear in, how do you do? Do you link document files, or?
You usually link. What I would do is go to hackmd.io. Which is a site that allows you to write in Markdown, a text editor for Markdown, and then screenshot and then link it in your piece as well. But in general, I will be honest, like if you are talking like in spacing wise, you can, it's a Google Doc, you can have all the spacing you want. It's easier to do spacing there than elsewhere, but if it is images, this is something I've seen quite a few people do, like Pride Falls, and I would strongly recommend against splitting the text up with images in its midst. It breaks the flow of the reader, so that should not be an issue for feedback cycles, because you usually are not going to share the images because you shouldn't.
Yeah, I was just speaking about the spacing.
So it's actually easier to do the spacing in the Google Doc than it is on Steemit by quite a bit. So that's not an issue.
Cool.
Okay, I think we're done. And I'm sorry, Steve, we only have so much time.
Yeah, awesome. Great session. Thanks everyone who critiqued or had their pieces critiqued, and thank you so much, Kai, for coming in and showing us the ropes.
You're all welcome.